Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug so aggressively awful that it doesn't just ruin your weekend, it kidnaps your weekend, holds it hostage for 5 days, and then hands it back to you looking like it lost a fight with a dumpster fire. We're talking about N-Ethylpentylone, NEP. A synthetic cathinone, a bath salt technically, that showed up at parties sometime around 2015 and immediately started destroying people's ability to sleep, blink correctly, or form a sentence that didn't sound like it was being transmitted from another dimension. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I make here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. Somehow it's always 2 a.m, and somehow that's exactly right for this one. And a genuinely warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your idea is what made tonight's episode happen, and that matters more than you know. The channel is also on Spotify now, so if you want to listen while you drift off, the link's in the description. Now, dim those lights, put on a fan, pull that blanket up to your chin, get horizontal if you haven't already, because tonight we're going somewhere deeply unpleasant so that you, safely in your bed, can be grateful you're not there. Let's pause for a moment and think about what NEP actually means in practice. Have you ever been so tired that you hallucinated a person standing in the corner? What would it feel like to lie in bed for 4 days, absolutely exhausted, and be completely physically incapable of falling asleep? What do you do when your brain is running at 6,000 RPM and your body is screaming for rest, and neither one of them is in charge anymore? What does 5 days without sleep look like from the inside? Would you still be you at the end of it? And what kind of person, knowing all of this, still takes a second dose? Congratulations, you've just woken up in a stranger's bathroom at 7 a.m. The year is 2016, give or take. You don't know how long you've been here. Your jaw hurts. Your heart is doing something medically inadvisable. There's no sleep coming. There hasn't been for a while. And somewhere out there, someone is already making more of this stuff in a kitchen that doesn't have a fume hood. Good luck. You've heard of cocaine, you've heard of MDMA, you might have even heard of mephedrone, but N-Ethylpentylone, NEP, sounds less like a party drug and more like a form you'd fill out when disputing a parking ticket. And yet here it is, a synthetic cathinone, a descendant of the cat plant, a designer drug cooked up in a lab specifically to exist in the legal grey zones that sprung up around the world in the early 2010s. It belongs to a family of compounds sometimes called bath salts, which is perhaps the most misleading branding in human history because nobody who has ever taken NEP has done so to achieve softer skin. It arrived quietly, mislabeled or unlabeled, sold in little pouches online or handed to someone at a party who thought they were getting something else. And then it did what it does. You're going to want to know exactly what that is. The cat plant, for context, has been chewed in East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula for centuries. It produces a mild stimulant effect, alertness, talkativeness, kind of buzz that gets you through an afternoon. Cathinone is the active compound responsible for that effect, and for most of human history it lived quietly in a plant and didn't trouble anyone much. Then along came organic chemistry. Organic. Synthetic cathinones are versions of that natural compound that have been modified in a laboratory, a methyl group added here, an ethyl chain there, to produce something stronger, longer lasting, and entirely unregulated, because the laws that banned cathinone didn't automatically apply to something technically different at the molecular level. Think of it as cooking from a recipe, then changing enough ingredients that you can legally call it a different dish. The dish, in this case, causes psychosis. NEP specifically, N-Ethylpentylone, is a third-generation synthetic cathinone, which means it appeared after regulators had already banned the first and second waves. It is distinguished from its predecessors by its potency, its duration, and its remarkable ability to prevent sleep in a way that other cathinones, even the notorious ones, don't quite match. Where something like mephedrone might keep you up until 4 a.m. and leave you feeling ragged by Sunday, NEP had a documented capacity to hold a person in a state of stimulated wakefulness for 96 hours or more. This is not a feature. This is a design flaw so severe it blurs into catastrophe. The name tells you nothing useful, which is part of the problem. N-Ethylpentylone is a chemical descriptor, not a warning. Street names, and NEP acquired several, including monkey dust in some UK regions, though that term was applied loosely to several compounds, carried connotations that were dramatic without being informative. Nobody hears monkey dust and immediately understands this compound may remove your ability to sleep for 5 days and generate hallucinatory visitors in your peripheral vision. Marketing, even accidental marketing, has never been particularly honest about this category of product. What you were actually dealing with, if you encountered NEP in the mid-2010s, was a white or off-white powder of indeterminate origin, purchased from a vendor who may or may not have tested it accurately, arriving without a dosing guide, a duration estimate, or a list of contraindications. You had a chemical formula, a rough category, and whatever second-hand information you could find on a forum written by someone who had taken it and survived. That was the sum total of available consumer information. Compare that to the label on a bottle of paracetamol. Compare that to the insert that comes with literally any prescription medication. Then consider that the gap between those two levels of information is where real people were making real decisions about what to put in their bodies, and you begin to understand how the story goes from a Friday night to an emergency room to a week of grey, flat nothing on the other side. It started with a name that sounded bureaucratic. It ended in ways that were anything but. Before NEP, there was a generation of synthetic drugs that existed purely because of how slowly the law moves and how quickly chemists can tweak a molecule. The early 2000s brought mephedrone, methylone and MDPV onto the global market, compounds that mimicked the effects of MDMA or cocaine, but were technically legal because they hadn't been scheduled yet. Governments scrambled to ban them, chemists adjusted a carbon chain here, an ethyl group there, and something new appeared before the ink on the last ban was even dry. It was a chemical arms race fought entirely in small online marketplaces with names that sounded like they sold garden supplies. NEP was born into this ecosystem, a product of the novel psychoactive substance era, a drug designed not to heal, not to treat, but simply to exist one step ahead of a spreadsheet at the Home Office. The loophole wasn't just exploited, it was industrialized. The term bath salts entered public consciousness around 2010, largely thanks to a series of alarming news stories that used it as shorthand for synthetic cathinones. The phrase was originally a marketing euphemism. Vendors sold these compounds labeled as bath salts, plant food, or research chemicals specifically to sidestep laws that regulated substances intended for human consumption. If the label said not for human consumption in small print, the legal argument was that the seller wasn't responsible for what the buyer did with it. It was the least convincing disclaimer in the history of product labelling, and it worked remarkably well for several years. The public reaction to bath salts was a mixture of genuine alarm and tabloid exaggeration. Reports of erratic behaviour, violence, and extreme physical agitation were real. MDPV in particular produced a profile of extreme agitation that made emergency departments deeply unhappy. But the coverage also generated a kind of mythology around this category of drug that was both accurate in its general warning and wildly inaccurate in its specifics. The famous 2012 Miami incident, in which a man attacked another person on a causeway, was attributed to bath salts within hours of occurring. Toxicology later showed he had cannabis in his system, not synthetic cathinones. The story had already run around the world by the time the facts arrived. This matters because the mythology shaped the response. Lawmakers, alarmed by dramatic coverage, moved to ban specific compounds, and did so repeatedly and with genuine speed by legislative standards. But the bans targeted named chemicals, and the chemists simply named their chemicals something else. By the time mephedrone was scheduled in the United Kingdom in 2010, successor compounds were already in development. By the time those were banned, NEP and its relatives were entering the market. What nobody in this chain, not the legislators, not the media, not the vendors, and certainly not the users, fully understood was that the new compounds were not interchangeable with the old ones. Each modification to the molecule changed the effect, the duration, the potency, and the risk profile in ways that were not predictable from the previous compound. The people taking NEP because they'd taken other cathinones before and found them manageable were working from data that no longer applied. The drug they had experience with was gone. What they had instead was something that looked the same in a bag, cost roughly the same, and behaved in completely different ways inside the human nervous system. The bath salt era didn't just produce dangerous drugs, it produced dangerous drugs with a false sense of familiarity attached. That combination, it turned out, was particularly effective at causing harm. The first time people started talking about NEP with genuine fear wasn't in a newspaper or a government health bulletin. It was on forums, on Reddit threads and harm reduction websites where users with handles like Cautious Just Chemhead and Survived 2015 started posting things like, "Please read this before you do what I did." The pattern that emerged from these early accounts was consistent enough to be alarming. People who took NEP expecting a few hours of stimulant euphoria instead found themselves awake for days, unable to eat, unable to sleep, and in many cases unable to stop. The reports were detailed, honest, and often written by people who were clearly still in the middle of the experience. Sentences trailing off, timestamps 3 a.m, 4 a.m, 2 days later. This was not the usual recreational drug discourse of highs and hangovers. This was something else, and people kept posting. Harm reduction forums occupy a strange and important space in the landscape of drug information. They are not medical resources. They are not regulated or peer-reviewed. They are populated by anonymous strangers writing from a range of mental and physical states, some of whom have chemistry degrees and some of whom do not. And yet in the case of novel psychoactive substances, where peer-reviewed research lagged years behind the market, they represented the most comprehensive real-world data set available. The early NEP threads on sites like Blue Light and Erowid were the pharmacovigilance system. There wasn't another one. What those threads documented with a consistency that became impossible to dismiss was a drug that behaved unlike what users expected. People with experience of other stimulants, cocaine, MDMA, amphetamine, even other cathinones, described NEP as categorically different in one specific way. It would not let them stop. Not the drug use necessarily, though that was part of it, but more fundamentally, it would not let them sleep. Other stimulants overstayed their welcome. NEP seemed to have no concept of leaving. Users described lying in bed, exhausted, desperate for sleep, watching the ceiling at hour 30, hour 40, hour 50, their bodies horizontal and their brains broadcasting at full volume with no sign of reduction. The compulsive redosing that other users warned about appeared in almost every extended report. Someone would take a dose, feel it wearing off, and take another, not necessarily because they wanted more of the high, but because the transition out of the high felt like standing on the edge of something unpleasant, and the easiest thing was to step back. Each redose extended the experience. Each extension made the eventual landing harder. The threads read like a collective slow-motion documentation of a trap closing. The community response was, in the way of harm reduction communities, both practically useful and quietly heartbreaking. People who had been through it posted detailed, specific advice for those still in the middle. Drink water. Eat something small, even if you can't face food. Try to lie down, even if sleep won't come. Do not take more. They described the crash in enough detail that someone reading it might understand what was coming and not panic. They recommended, gently and repeatedly, that if things were getting medically serious, the forum was not the right place to be. These posts were written by people who had no professional obligation to help, no funding, no institutional support. They were just people who'd been through something bad and wanted the next person to be less alone in it. In a space defined by risk, that impulse toward care was something. The irony, of course, is that the people most likely to read those warning threads were people who were already planning to take the drug or already had. The people who most needed the information were the least positioned to act on it in the moment. That gap between the knowledge that existed and the moment in which it could have been useful is where a lot of the harm in this story lives. NEP works the way most stimulant drugs work, just turned up to a volume that's technically past the last tick on the dial. It's a reuptake inhibitor and releaser of monoamine neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. In plain language, it floods your brain with the chemicals responsible for pleasure, alertness, focus, and the feeling that everything is right now extremely important and interesting. Your reward circuitry lights up like a pinball machine. Your body receives signals that read as urgent, awake, and not done yet. The problem is that NEP is particularly aggressive about this. It binds strongly, releases generously, and crucially, it doesn't let go quickly. Its half-life is poorly understood, its metabolites are active, and the duration of its effects stretches far beyond what most people plan for. You sit down expecting a few hours of stimulation and stand up, metaphorically, somewhere in the middle of day 3. To understand what NEP is doing in your brain, it helps to understand what dopamine is actually for. Dopamine is not, as it's often described, simply the pleasure chemical. It is more specifically the anticipation chemical, the signal your brain fires when it expects a reward, and again more intensely when it gets one. It is the mechanism by which the brain learns what is worth doing again. Evolution shaped this system to reinforce behaviors essential to survival: eating, reproduction, social bonding. These activities feel rewarding because dopamine makes them feel rewarding. A drug that floods the dopamine system isn't so much giving you pleasure as it is hijacking the part of your brain that decides what matters and telling it that the drug is the most important thing that has ever existed. Norepinephrine is doing something else in this picture, and it's the part most relevant to the sleep problem. Norepinephrine is your alertness signal. It's the compound that sharpens attention, raises heart rate, increases blood pressure, and tells the body that the current moment requires active engagement. When you're in danger, when something loud and sudden happens nearby, norepinephrine is the thing that makes you jump, focus, and respond. NEP releases norepinephrine in quantities the body associates with sustained serious emergency, and the body responds accordingly. Pulse elevated, breathing shallow, attention riveted, sleep impossible. This is not a side effect of NEP. This is NEP working exactly as its chemistry dictates, telling every system that controls rest to stand down indefinitely. Serotonin is also in the mix, contributing to the initial feeling of warmth and well-being that characterizes the early phase of the experience. It's part of why the first few hours feel manageable, even pleasant. Serotonin is associated with contentment, with social ease, with the comfortable sense that things are fine. It is, in this context, the bait. While serotonin is making the experience feel approachable, dopamine is locking in the memory of how good this was, and norepinephrine is winding the nervous system to a tension it won't be able to release for days. The half-life question, how long the drug remains active, is where NEP distinguishes itself from other cathinoids in ways that are deeply inconvenient. A drug with a short half-life peaks quickly and clears quickly. What you get is intense but brief. NEP does not behave this way. Its active metabolites, the compounds the body produces while breaking it down, are themselves pharmacologically active, meaning the drug continues doing something even while being processed. Duration of effect is reported in user accounts as extending well beyond the expected window for compounds in this class. This is why people who took what they thought was a reasonable dose at midnight were still awake, and still affected at noon the following day, and the day after that. Your brain, by the end of this process, has been held at full volume for a duration it was not designed to sustain. It has spent dopamine it doesn't have. It has run norepinephrine at a level appropriate for continuous emergency. It has forgotten, chemically, what rest feels like. When the drug finally begins to clear, what is left is not a brain returning to normal. It is a brain running on empty in a room that's gone very quiet, trying to remember how all of this is supposed to work. Part of what makes NEP so specifically catastrophic is that for most of its existence, nobody agreed on what a dose even was. Pharmaceutical drugs come with packaging, trials, years of research into effective doses, maximum doses, and the dose at which things go badly wrong. NEP came in a baggie with no instructions and a molecular weight. Early users estimated from other cathinones, which was like using a recipe for a bicycle to build a helicopter. Some compounds in this family are active in the hundreds of milligrams. NEP, it turned out, is active in the tens of milligrams, meaning that people who thought they were doing a moderate dose were actually doing something several times larger than necessary for full effect. And because the onset is sometimes slow, and the effect isn't always immediately obvious, the instinct to redose, to take a bit more because surely it's not working yet, was both understandable and, in many cases, the moment things got truly out of hand. The measuring problem alone deserves some time. Even a user who had good information about NEP's potency, who knew it was more active at lower doses than comparable compounds, was facing a practical challenge. How do you accurately measure 15 milligrams of a white powder in a kitchen at midnight? A milligram is 1,000th of a gram. A standard kitchen scale has a margin of error that makes 15 milligrams essentially guesswork. A proper milligram accurate scale costs money, requires some knowledge to use, and is owned by approximately no one who is encountering NEP for the first time at a party. The gap between what you should take and what you actually took was, for most users, invisible and potentially enormous. Add to this the variable purity of the product. NEP was not produced under pharmaceutical quality controls. It was synthesized in labs of widely varying competence and sold through supply chains with no testing requirements. A batch might be 80% pure or 40% pure, and the user had no way of knowing which. A dose that produced a manageable experience with one batch might produce an overwhelming one with the next, purely because of chemistry that happened before the substance reached anyone. This is the specific horror of unregulated drug supply. The same powder in the same kind of bag from what appears to be the same source can be meaningfully different each time. Then there is the onset delay. Some users reported that NEP did not produce obvious effects immediately, that there was a window of 15 to 30 minutes, sometimes longer, during which not much seemed to be happening. This window is dangerous because it invites a second dose. The logic is entirely understandable. You've taken something, you don't feel it yet. Maybe you didn't take enough. The second dose arrives in the bloodstream approximately when the first dose is beginning to peak, meaning both doses hit simultaneously. The effect is not double what a single dose produces. It is something else, something less predictable, more intense, and considerably harder to manage. This specific sequence appears in harm reduction literature so frequently that it began to feel like a standard feature of NEP's damage pattern. Not one bad decision, but two reasonable-seeming decisions made in quick succession that combined into something neither one would have been alone. The absence of standardized dosing information wasn't an oversight. It was a structural feature of the market. A vendor selling NEP had no incentive to include accurate dosing information, because accurate dosing information would have included the fact that most people should take very little of it. It was, from a commercial standpoint, not in the product's interest to be used carefully, and so it wasn't. And so people used it carelessly, not out of recklessness, but out of a genuine absence of any reliable information to be careful with. There is a difference between ignoring warnings and never having received them. Most people who encountered NEP had never received them. The first few hours of NEP are, by most accounts, actually enjoyable. There's your warning sign, right there, wrapped in a bow. Users report euphoria, talkativeness, heightened energy, a sharpening of perception that makes music sound better and conversation feel effortless. It's warm. It's social. It's the kind of thing that makes a person at a party at midnight think, Yes, this was a good call. The body feels capable. The mind feels quick. There is absolutely no indication in those first hours that you are currently boarding a train that doesn't have a stop for the next 4.5 days. This is the part that keeps synthetic cathinones alive on the market. The beginning is good. The beginning is often genuinely good. And the human brain, with its extraordinary talent for optimism and its almost willful refusal to read the rest of the story, files those first hours away under evidence that this was fine, actually. The early NEP experience, as described across hundreds of user reports, has a particular quality that distinguishes it from other stimulants. Where cocaine is often described as sharp and edged, bright and slightly anxious, confidence spiked with a low buzz of urgency, and MDMA is described as warm and empathic and somatic. NEP in its first phase is often characterized as both, mentally sharp and physically warm simultaneously. Users describe feeling present, articulate, and interested in everyone around them. Music has more texture. Conversations feel more honest. The body is energized but not jangling. In those first few hours, there is a case to be made that this is a reasonable thing to have done. This is important to understand, not to make a case for the drug, but to understand why people took it repeatedly. The early phase is not an illusion in the sense of a false promise. The feeling is genuine as any neurochemical state. It is an illusion in the sense that it is not representative of what follows. The experience that is being stored in memory during those first hours, the experience that the brain will later reference when deciding whether to do this again, is not the experience of day 3. It is the experience of hour 2, and hour 2, by almost all accounts, is genuinely pleasant. Your brain is not stupid. It is doing its job. The job just happens to be optimized for a world that doesn't contain NEP. The social dimension of the early experience is worth noting. Most stimulants increase sociability to some degree, but NEP in its initial phase produces a talkativeness and openness that many users compare favorably to MDMA. This made it a drug that spread through social networks, passed between friends at parties, taken in groups, encountered in contexts where the person offering it was visibly fine and having a good time because they were fine and having a good time. Hour 2 is a convincing ambassador for hour 2. It is a terrible ambassador for hour 72. The appetite suppression begins early, though most people at a party at midnight don't register not being hungry as a warning sign. It is 1. The body is receiving signals that override the systems governing hunger. This is a preview of what's coming, not just that you won't eat tonight, but that the systems governing basic physical needs are being systematically overridden. Hunger, sleep, the need to stop. These are the signals that get quieted first. The brain, running on dopamine and norepinephrine, does not believe it needs anything it's not currently getting. And for a few hours in a party with good music and people you like, that feels like freedom. It is not freedom. It is the absence of information that would have been extremely useful later. Here is the thing about drugs that work on dopamine. They are extremely good at making you want more of them. This is not a character flaw. This is neurochemistry doing exactly what it was built to do. The brain's reward system evolved to encourage behaviors that kept you alive, eating, moving, connecting with other humans. It never anticipated a compound that would hit every reward receptor at once with the subtlety of a freight train. With NEP, the compulsion to redose is reported as unusually powerful, even by people who have experience with other stimulants. The euphoria fades before the stimulation does, meaning you feel wide awake and vaguely chasing something you can no longer quite reach. Taking more seems logical. Taking more makes things worse. This loop, the pursuit of that first hour, the inability to sleep, the redose, the further departure from any normal state, is the mechanism by which a Friday night turns into a Tuesday morning. The neurochemistry of the compulsion loop involves a concept called dopaminergic depletion. When a stimulus, a drug, a food, a rewarding experience, causes a large release of dopamine, the brain responds by reducing its sensitivity to that stimulus. It downregulates dopamine receptors, essentially turning down the volume on its own reward system to compensate for the abnormally high signal. The practical effect of this is tolerance. The same dose produces less effect than it did the first time. The practical consequence of that is dosing upward to compensate. The practical consequence of that is further depletion. The loop does not have a graceful exit point. It has a collapse point. What makes N-Ep's compulsion profile particularly notable, even within the stimulant class, is the specific mismatch between the fading euphoria and the persisting stimulation. Cocaine, for comparison, has a relatively short half-life. The high and the stimulation roughly co-occur and co-exit. When it wears off, you feel its absence clearly, and that feeling, while unpleasant, is at least informative. It tells you the drug is done. With N-Ep, the euphoric warmth of the early experience fades while the norepinephrine-driven stimulation remains. You feel the absence of the pleasant part while still being fully wired. The result is a state that is simultaneously incomplete and overwhelming, a crash without rest, a come down without the down. Redosing feels like a correction of this imbalance. It is not a correction. It is an extension of the problem that will make the eventual resolution considerably worse. People who have described this loop in harm reduction forums often note a specific quality of awareness within it. They knew, in some part of themselves, that they should stop. They could observe themselves continuing anyway. This is not a failure of willpower. It is a description of what it feels like when the part of the brain responsible for executive function, the prefrontal cortex, the part that can hold a future consequence in mind and weigh it against a present impulse, is operating in a neurochemical environment that is specifically hostile to that kind of reasoning. The prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop in adolescence, and one of the first to be compromised by stimulant intoxication. You're watching yourself make a decision that you know is wrong, from inside a brain that has temporarily lost the capacity to act on that knowledge. That is the compulsion loop. It is not a metaphor. The external consequences of continuing are also at the time of the decision abstract. They exist in the future. The present is loud and immediate and pressing. The body is awake and the mind is moving fast and the future is hours away. This is the pharmacological reduction of time horizon. The drug, by flooding reward circuitry and stimulating alertness, makes the present moment enormously vivid and the future effectively invisible. What happens tomorrow is real. It does not feel real from inside hour 6, redosing into hour 7, chasing something that is getting further away with each step toward it. There is a specific window in a NEP experience, somewhere around the 10 to 14 hour mark, that in retrospect almost everyone identifies as the moment things went wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not yet, just slightly off. The jaw is tight. The thoughts are coming a bit faster than comfortable. The idea of sleep is still technically conceivable but feels somehow irrelevant, like packing an umbrella for a trip to the moon. This is the window in which a person could theoretically stop. Put down the baggie, drink some water, lie very still in a darkened room and wait for it to pass. Some people do this. Those people are fine, relatively speaking. Many people don't, because at hour 12, the decision-making part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for thinking this through, is operating in an environment that is no longer favourable to careful cost-benefit analysis. It feels like a choice. It is not really a choice. The jaw tightness is worth paying attention to because it appears in almost every extended account of NEP use, and almost nobody identifies it as a warning sign in the moment. Bruxism, involuntary clenching and grinding of teeth and jaw muscles, is a common effect of stimulants generally, and is particularly associated with cathinones. It is the body's skeletal muscles responding to the same norepinephrine flood that is raising heart rate and blood pressure. Everything is tense. The jaw is just the part you can feel most clearly. Users who have been through it describe waking up days later with jaws that ached from hours of sustained clenching. they were not aware of and could not have stopped. The jaw at hour 12 is a telegram from the nervous system. It reads, "This is not what rest feels like." The cognitive change at this stage is subtle but specific. Thinking has not slowed. If anything, it has accelerated. But the quality of the acceleration has changed. In the first few hours, the speed felt productive. Thoughts connected cleanly. Conversation was easier. The mind felt useful. By hour 12, the speed has become something slightly different. Ideas are arriving too fast to examine. Topics shift before they're finished. There is a quality of mental busyness that superficially resembles being engaged and productively occupied, but that, on examination, is going in circles. You have had the same thoughts several times. You're not sure how long you've been talking. You have lost track of what you started saying midway through saying it. This is not creativity. This is a CPU running too hot, generating a lot of activity and producing diminishing output. The environment at hour 12 tends to amplify the difficulty of stopping. If you're at a party, the party is still happening. The music is still good. The people are still there. Leaving, going home, going to bed, extracting yourself from the situation in which the drug took hold, requires a decision made by a decision-making system that is no longer working well. It requires planning, which requires a horizon beyond the immediate present. It requires an honest appraisal of how you feel, which is difficult when the drug is making you feel like you're fine. And it requires overriding the social context, which is, for most people, hard to do even under ideal neurological conditions. The party is a trap, not by design, but by coincidence of timing. Hour 12 and the social context of ongoing celebration make a particularly effective combination for continuing past the point where continuing makes sense. People who did stop at hour 12, who lay down and waited and got through the discomfort of a long but not catastrophic come down, describe it as one of the better decisions they made in that period. They describe it the way you describe a near miss, with relief that has some residual shakiness in it. The ones who didn't stop mostly describe hour 12 in retrospect, looking back from somewhere much further in, as the turn they missed. Sleep is not optional. This seems obvious, but it bears spelling out in some detail, because NEP has a way of making the body forget it. At 24 hours without sleep, cognitive performance declines to roughly the equivalent of a blood alcohol level of 0.1%. Legally drunk, in most jurisdictions, behind the wheel of a car. At 48 hours, the brain begins to generate what are called micro-sleeps. Brief involuntary shutdowns lasting a fraction of a second to several seconds, during which a person is essentially unconscious while appearing awake. At 72 hours, hallucinations begin, not metaphorical ones, actual visual and auditory disturbances, intrusions of dream state imagery into waking perception. And all of this is happening in a person whose central nervous system is simultaneously being flooded with compounds that are actively, aggressively preventing sleep from arriving. The exhaustion is total, the rest is impossible. The brain, caught between two impossible states, does something it was never designed to do. It tries to sleep while awake. The science of sleep deprivation has been studied extensively, largely through experiment and largely not through the specific mechanism of NEP, which adds the complication of pharmacological stimulation on top of ordinary sleep loss. But the baseline research is stark enough on its own. Sleep is not a passive state. It is an active physiological process during which the brain performs essential maintenance. The glymphatic system, a network of channels through which cerebrospinal fluid flows, is dramatically more active during sleep, flushing out metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours. Among those waste products is adenosine, the compound that builds up throughout the day and produces the sensation of tiredness. NEP suppresses adenosine signaling, meaning the cleaning mechanism is blocked and the cleanup signal is silenced simultaneously. The emotional consequences of sleep deprivation arrive before the perceptual ones. At the 24-hour mark, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes hyperreactive. Stimuli that would not register as threatening under normal circumstances begin to feel urgent, meaningful, even frightening. This manifests as a creeping anxiety that most NEP users report entering the picture around day 1, a background hum of unease that is partly pharmacological and partly the product of a brain that has stopped being able to regulate its own emotional responses. The world begins to feel slightly wrong, nothing specific, just slightly, persistently, wrongly textured. By 48 hours, the microsleeps are happening whether the person wants them to or not. These are not naps. They are not restorative. They are the brain's circuit breakers tripping briefly under load, a quarter second of darkness, a half second of nothing, experienced as a blink or a brief gap in continuity. People mid-conversation suddenly realize they have lost the last sentence. People mid-task find their hands have stopped moving. The brain is shutting down in increments because the alternative is shutting down entirely. The NEP is still fighting this, still sending wakefulness signals, still holding the nervous system at simulated alert. The two processes, the body-forcing microsleeps and the drug preventing actual sleep, produce a state that is genuinely novel and genuinely terrible. A person who is neither asleep nor properly awake, existing in a flickering in-between that resembles neither state and restores nothing. At 72 hours, without pharmacological intervention, the hallucinations begin in most people. This is not because those people are fragile or psychologically unusual. It is because the human brain, after 3 days without sleep, begins to do this universally. The visual cortex, running without the regulatory input of normal sleep cycles, starts generating content autonomously. The auditory cortex does the same. You're not dreaming. You are, in a very specific technical sense, dreaming while awake. Because the boundary between waking consciousness and dreaming consciousness, which is maintained by sleep architecture, has been eroded past the point of reliable function, and NEP is keeping you standing in the room while this happens. By day 2 or 3 of a serious NEP experience, many users report what the harm reduction community describes, with admirable understatement, as unusual perceptual phenomena. The more common lay term is terrifying. Shadow figures at the periphery of vision that disappear when looked at directly. Patterns in walls that breathe or shift. Voices that might be the television or might not be. The sense that something is in the room that wasn't there a moment ago. This is the brain's visual cortex beginning to generate content without external input. The same process that produces dreams, now occurring while the eyes are open and the person is technically conscious. The clinical term is stimulant psychosis, and it is not metaphorical. It is not feeling a bit weird. It is a temporary but genuine departure from consensus reality, and it is happening to a person who is also very tired and very much alone at 4 a.m. in an apartment that has started doing things apartments are not supposed to do. The peripheral figures are particularly consistent across accounts, consistent enough to be striking. Almost everyone who reaches the hallucination stage of a long NEP experience describes the same thing. Movement at the edge of vision that isn't there when directly viewed. Figures that might be human, might not be, standing in doorways or corners or just outside the window. The brain's threat detection system, already hyperactivated by stimulant-driven norepinephrine and by sleep deprivation's effect on the amygdala, is generating phantom threats. It is doing what it evolved to do, pattern matching for potential danger. Under normal circumstances, this system is calibrated by sensory input and corrected by sleep. After 70+ sleepless stimulant hours, it has been running uncorrected long enough to start generating its own content. The figures are the brain's threat radar producing signals in the absence of signal. The auditory hallucinations follow a different pattern. Rather than clear voices or sounds, most accounts describe what might be called almost sound, the sense that someone said something in the next room, just below the threshold of understanding. A name that might have been called, or might have been the heating. A conversation that stops when you listen for it. This is the auditory cortex doing the same thing the visual cortex is doing, generating probable content from noise, running its pattern-matching algorithms without adequate external signal to anchor them. The results are ambiguous in exactly the worst way. Not clear enough to dismiss, not clear enough to confirm, leaving the already stressed brain in a state of persistent low-grade vigilance about things that are not there. What makes the hallucination stage of NEP psychosis particularly disorienting is that it doesn't arrive all at once. There is a gradual accumulation, a progression from, that was a bit weird through I think something might be wrong with my perception, to a state in which a person genuinely cannot reliably distinguish what is external from what is being generated internally. Users describe this progression with a kind of awful lucidity. They often knew something wasn't real. They just couldn't make that knowledge translate into perceiving it as not real. The intellectual understanding and the perceptual experience were decoupled. You could believe you were hallucinating while simultaneously experiencing the hallucination as though it were happening. This is not a comfortable position to be in at 4 a.m. with a racing heart and nobody sober nearby. The duration of stimulant psychosis varies, and this is important. For most people, it resolves as the drug clears and sleep eventually arrives. It is not a permanent condition. It is a functional state produced by specific neurochemical conditions, and when those conditions change, the state changes. This is not always comforting when you're in the middle of it, but it is true, and it is the difference between NEP psychosis and other conditions it can temporarily resemble. The walls stop moving, the figures go away, the sense of wrongness gradually, bumpily retreats. The brain, given rest, remembers how to be a brain. This is one of the small mercies in an experience that is not heavy with them. While the brain is busy hallucinating and the mind is busy panicking about the hallucinations, the heart is having its own separate emergency. NEP, like all cathinones, is a powerful cardiovascular stimulant. It raises heart rate. It raises blood pressure, it causes vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels, which means the heart is working harder to push blood through a system that is actively resisting it. Tachycardia, a heart rate above 100 beats per minute, is considered essentially standard for a meaningful NEP experience. Rates well above that are documented in emergency presentations, and unlike the psychological effects, which are at least somewhat manageable if you know they're coming, the cardiovascular effects don't care whether you're experienced, prepared, or sitting very still trying to calm down. Your heart is doing what the drug is telling it to do, and the drug is telling it to sprint. The heart is a muscle, and like all muscles, it can be worked too hard. Under normal conditions, the cardiovascular system has an elegant feedback mechanism. Elevated heart rate and blood pressure trigger receptors that signal for a reduction, maintaining the system within safe parameters. NEP disrupts this feedback by holding the stimulating signal, the norepinephrine flood, at a sustained level that overrides the body's self-regulation. The heart doesn't receive the signal to ease off. It keeps going. It is a car with its accelerator held down and its cruise control disabled, on a road that continues well past the point where the driver wanted to stop. Hypothermia, elevated body temperature, accompanies this cardiovascular activation and creates its own set of complications. The body generates heat through metabolic activity, and a NEP dramatically increases metabolic activity. In a cool environment with adequate hydration, this is manageable, unpleasant, but manageable. In a warm environment, a crowded party, a summer night, a room where multiple people have been active for hours, the body's ability to dissipate heat through sweat is overwhelmed. Core temperature rises. The consequences of sustained elevated core temperature include cardiac arrhythmia, muscle breakdown, kidney damage, and in severe cases, organ failure. This is not a theoretical chain of events. It appears in the case literature associated with cathinone-related deaths. The experience of cardiac awareness, the ability to feel your own heartbeat, is itself deeply distressing, and something most people do not usually notice. At rest, the heart beats quietly enough that most people are unaware of it as a mechanical fact. Under NEP, the force and speed of cardiac contractions becomes palpable. You can feel it in your chest, in your throat, occasionally in your ears. This palpable awareness, combined with the anxiety that stimulants produce and the sleep deprivation that removes the brain's capacity to regulate alarm, creates a feedback loop in which the heart being felt as alarming makes the alarm response physiological, which makes the heart work harder, which makes it more alarming. Users describe this loop in terms that are hard to read without some sympathy. Lying still, trying to breathe slowly, feeling their heart banging in their chest at 3 a.m, unable to tell whether this is the drug or a medical emergency, and having no reliable way to know. Most presentations did not result in permanent cardiac damage. The heart, like the brain, is a resilient organ. It sustains periods of abnormal demand and recovers, but most is not all, and the margin between an unpleasant cardiovascular experience and a serious cardiac event is thinner than most people taking an unlabeled powder from an unknown source are equipped to assess. The heart was never consulted about this decision. It is simply running the program it was given, as fast and as hard as the chemistry demands, waiting, like everything else involved in a NEP experience, for it to be over. Poison control centres and emergency departments in the United Kingdom, the United States, and across Europe began accumulating NEP-related presentations from around 2015 onward. The clinical picture, when it arrived through the doors, was consistent. Extreme agitation, elevated heart rate, hypothermia, and in many cases a level of confusion so profound that patients couldn't accurately report what they had taken, when they had taken it, or how much. Some were brought in by friends, some called ambulances themselves, some were found by strangers. The treatments available were largely supportive: sedation to reduce agitation and protect the cardiovascular system, fluids, monitoring. There was no antidote because there is no antidote. You wait for the drug to clear, you keep the person alive while it does, and you try to manage the symptoms of a nervous system that has been asked to do something it cannot sustain. Many of these patients had no idea they had taken NEP specifically. They thought they had taken something else. The clinical management of acute cathinone toxicity is, by necessity, empirical. It is based on treating the symptoms presented rather than reversing a specific mechanism, because no reversal agent exists. Benzodiazepines, which reduce neurological hyperactivity and have some cardiovascular stabilizing effect, became the standard first-line treatment for the severe agitation that characterized many presentations. They were not without risk in this context. A patient whose heart rate has been sustained at alarming levels by a stimulant and who is then sedated with a depressant creates a complex pharmacological situation that requires careful monitoring. Getting it right required experience, equipment, and time, all of which emergency departments have in varying quantities. The toxicological identification of NEP in presenting patients was, for a significant period, difficult. Standard drug screens used in emergency settings test for known, scheduled substances. Novel psychoactive substances, by definition, are not on those screens. A patient who had taken NEP presented with a clinical picture consistent with sympathomimetic toxicity, stimulant poisoning, but the specific agent could not be identified in real time. Comprehensive toxicological analysis capable of identifying novel cathinones required specialist laboratories and days to process. By the time results returned, the acute clinical situation had resolved one way or another. The identification was useful for epidemiology, for understanding what was circulating, what was being taken, but not for guiding immediate treatment in the way that knowing a patient had taken a known substance would have been. The geography of presentations was informative. NEP-related emergency department attendances were not evenly distributed. They clustered around specific regions, parts of the West Midlands in England, certain cities in the United States, suggesting that the drug was entering specific local drug markets at specific times and spreading through those networks. This clustering was useful for public health monitoring. It allowed local health authorities to issue targeted warnings, to alert hospitals in the relevant areas that they were likely to see more presentations, and to preposition resources. It was not enough to prevent those presentations, but it was something the emergency health response system adapting imperfectly and in real time to a supply chain it had no control over. The people who came through those doors are worth noting as people rather than data points. They were not, as a demographic, the profile that headlines tend to assign to drug emergencies. They were young and middle-aged. They were employed and unemployed. They were first-time drug users and experienced ones. They were people who thought they were taking something else, people who knew exactly what they were taking, people who were found in streets and people who called for help themselves. The emergency room does not filter by story. It takes whoever arrives, in whatever state they arrive in, and does what it can. That is the reality on which all of the other realities in this story ultimately land. One of the least discussed and most dangerous features of the synthetic drug market is that what's on the label and what's in the bag are frequently different things. NEP has been sold as MDMA. It has been sold as cocaine. It has been sold as other milder cathinones. It has been sold as research chemicals with no specific identity claimed at all. The person buying it may have done careful harm reduction research on what they thought they were purchasing and arrived at a party with a detailed plan for a completely different drug. The onset curve is different. The duration is different. The dose is wildly different. The safety profile is entirely different. And by the time the discrepancy becomes apparent, it is usually apparent in a way that is not convenient to address. Drug checking services, organizations that use chemical testing to identify what a substance actually contains, began flagging NEP with increasing frequency, sometimes finding it in samples that were sold as something else entirely. The gap between what people thought they were taking and what was actually in their bloodstream was, in some years and some regions, enormous. The supply chain dynamics that produce this mislabeling are not mysterious. They are the predictable outcome of an unregulated market operating at scale. At the point of synthesis, the producer knows what they've made. At the point of bulk distribution, the product may still be accurately identified, but as it moves through the supply chain, through multiple hands, divided and repackaged and resold, the identity of the substance can be lost, altered, or deliberately misrepresented. A mid-level distributor selling something as MDMA may genuinely not know that what they received was primarily NEP. A street-level seller who has been told it's cocaine has no analytical chemistry capability to verify that claim, and the end user, making a decision about what to put in their body, is at the end of a chain of uncertainty that started several transactions ago. The MDMA substitution was particularly consequential because the early phases of NEP resemble, to a casual user, the early phases of MDMA. The warmth, the sociability, the heightened sensory engagement, these are qualities that a person expecting MDMA would recognize as plausible. The discrepancy doesn't become apparent in the first hour. It becomes apparent somewhere around hour 6 or 12 or 20, when the MDMA they thought they took would have been largely metabolized and they would be coming down, and instead they are still fully stimulated and becoming unable to sleep. By that point, the decision that produced this situation is not reversible. The drug is in the bloodstream. The only option is to get through it. Drug checking as a harm reduction intervention directly addresses this problem, and the evidence for its effectiveness is compelling. Studies following the introduction of drug checking at events consistently show that a significant proportion of substances brought for testing are not what the person who brought them believed them to be. The behavioural response to that information, the person declining to take the substance, or taking a much smaller amount or seeking support, constitutes a direct harm reduction in real time. It is not a perfect solution. Not everyone uses checking services, not all events have them available, and the result of a test doesn't automatically translate into a rational decision by a person, in a social context designed to encourage risk. But it is a real intervention with real outcomes. The argument against it, that it facilitates drug use, runs into the practical problem that the drug use was already happening, and happening with less information rather than more. The mislabeling problem extends beyond NEP specifically to the entire landscape of substance adulteration that defines unregulated drug markets. Fentanyl in heroin, novel benzodiazepines in pressed pills, multiple cathinones in a single sample sold as one thing. The proliferation of novel compounds didn't just create new drugs. It created a market in which the identity of any given substance was genuinely uncertain, and in which the techniques needed to verify that identity were not available to the people making decisions about use. This is not a drug problem in the traditional sense. It is an information problem with drug-shaped consequences. Let's walk through it. Not to be grim, well, a little to be grim, but also because understanding the timeline is the only way to grasp the specific awfulness of what NEP can do. Hour 1 through 6. Euphoria, stimulation, completely manageable. Hour 6 through 12. Still high, jaw tightening, thoughts accelerating, the idea of sleep beginning to seem somehow beside the point. Hour 12 through 24. Mounting anxiety, difficulty speaking clearly, heart rate elevated, the first hints that something is structurally wrong with this experience. Hour 24 through 48. Sleep is being attempted and failing. The body is horizontal, but the brain is broadcasting at full volume. Day 3. The walls are doing something. There are shapes. Someone may or may not have just said your name from the other room. Day 4. Dissociation. Physical exhaustion. So complete, it has become a kind of numbness, the inability to eat anything. Day 5. A person who left the house last Friday is sitting very still in a darkened room waiting to feel like a human being again and wondering how long that takes. The specific texture of each phase deserves examination, because the progression is not a smooth decline. It is uneven, surprising, and punctuated with moments that feel like improvement and turn out not to be. Day 2 is particularly treacherous. The initial high has faded. The person has been awake for more than 24 hours and is beginning to feel this as a fact. There is a window in which things feel slightly better, slightly calmer, slightly less overwhelming, that can be mistaken for the drug wearing off and recovery beginning. It is not recovery. It is a pause. The drug is still present. The metabolites are still active. The window closes. The stimulation resumes. The hope that it was almost over turns out to have been ahead of itself. Day 3 introduces the physical dimension in a way that Day 2 doesn't fully. The body has been running at elevated metabolic rate for over 48 hours. It has not been adequately fed. It has not rested. Muscles that have been tense for 2 days begin to ache with a diffuse, sourceless quality, not the pain of injury, but the pain of sustained abnormal demand. Hands may tremble. Fine motor coordination, which was unaffected in the early phase, begins to slip. Simple tasks, typing a text message, pouring water, require more attention than they should. The body is demonstrating through these small failures that it is not okay. The mind, still partially stimulated, still partially in the drug's grip, is slow to receive this information. Day 4 is the day that most accounts describe as the hardest to get through. Not because it's the worst, by some measures Day 3's hallucinations are more acutely distressing, but because of the quality of the exhaustion. Day 4 is when the body has fully understood that something is very wrong and has not yet received any relief. The emotional flatness that precedes a stimulant crash begins to arrive while the stimulation is still present, creating a state that is neither high nor normal nor resting, just wrong. Dissociation. The sense of being slightly outside oneself, of watching from a small distance, is common. It is the brain's protective mechanism, a kind of soft focus over experience that mercifully blurs the worst of what is happening. It is also frightening in its own way, to feel not quite connected to the body doing the experiencing. Day 5, in accounts that reach day 5, is described with a consistent quality of diminishment. Not dramatic, not acute, just very, very small. Sitting in a room, not moving much, not thinking complex thoughts, waiting. The drug is wearing off. The body knows. The animal need for sleep is enormous and very close. When sleep finally comes, really comes, not the failed attempts of the preceding days, it is described as something absolute. Not pleasant exactly, just total. The body taking what it needs without asking permission. The person disappearing into it for 12, 15, 18 hours, and waking on the other side into something that is not quite normal, but is at least, finally, quiet. Stimulant crashes are unpleasant as a general category. A NEP crash, after several days of sustained use, is something that users describe with a vocabulary usually reserved for natural disasters. The dopamine system, which has been running at maximum output for days, is now essentially depleted. The result is a depression that is not just psychological, but biochemical. Not sadness exactly, but a flatness so complete that nothing registers. Food has no taste. Music has no texture. Sleep, the thing the body has been screaming for, finally arrives, but it brings no joy. Just 16 or 18 or 20 hours of unconsciousness that ends with a person waking up feeling not rested, but simply less destroyed than before. Anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, can persist for days after the stimulant effects have cleared. Some users report weeks. The brain takes time to restock what NEP spent. During that time, the world is grey and dull and very loud in a muffled sort of way, and the only mercy is that it eventually ends. The biochemistry of the crash is essentially the mirror image of the high, where the drug produced an abundance of neurotransmitters, dopamine flooded in, receptors activated, reward circuitry lit. The aftermath is the accounting. Dopamine levels are below baseline because the system has been depleted and simultaneously downregulated. The receptors that were flooded for days have reduced their sensitivity as a compensatory response and have not yet had time to restore it. The result is a brain that is chemically, measurably less capable of experiencing reward than it was before the drug was taken. This is not a metaphor for feeling bad. It is a description of a functional deficit that exists at the level of neurotransmitter availability and receptor density. It will resolve. It takes time. While it's resolving, almost nothing feels worth doing or feeling. The sleep that follows a long NEP experience is often described as long but poor quality. Users report sleeping for extended periods, sometimes more than 20 hours in the first recovery day, but waking feeling unrefreshed, as though the sleep produced rest without restoration. This is consistent with what is known about stimulant effects on sleep architecture. Even after the stimulant has cleared, the sleep stages most associated with physical and cognitive recovery, slow-wave sleep and REM, may be disrupted for days. The body is getting unconsciousness. It is not initially getting the specific kind of unconsciousness it needs. This is one of the reasons recovery from a multi-day NEP experience takes longer than the simple math of hours awake versus hours asleep would suggest. Appetite returns gradually and unevenly. The first day or two after crash onset, most users describe a complete absence of hunger, the body still running suppressed digestive signals even as the stimulant fades. When hunger does return, it often returns as an intense craving for simple carbohydrates, bread, sugar, starchy foods. This is the body following its available energy recovery protocol, requesting the fastest available fuel. The practical difficulty is that eating after days of not eating is physically uncomfortable. The stomach has been empty for so long that food feels invasive. Users describe eating small amounts and stopping because the body is not yet ready to process normal meal volumes, even though it genuinely needs nutrition. The recovery from the crash is, in this way, a negotiation between the body's needs and its capacity to meet them. The emotional dimension of the crash is complicated by context. Most people coming out of a long NEP experience are coming out of it in circumstances that are also objectively difficult. They may have missed work, damaged relationships, spent money they didn't have, said things they didn't mean, or ended up somewhere they don't entirely remember arriving. The biochemical anhedonia sits on top of this real-world aftermath. The grey flatness of dopamine depletion is compounded by the concrete consequences of the experience. There is no clean line between the neurochemical recovery and the psychological reckoning. They happen simultaneously, intertwined, in a person who is also very tired and not yet capable of experiencing much comfort. The people who get through it best are those who have someone to tell the truth to. The telling, it turns out, helps. This seems like it should have an obvious answer. Surely nobody, having experienced 5 days without sleep in a cardiovascular situation that could charitably be described as inadvisable, would want to do that again. And yet, the dopamine system does not learn lessons. It catalogues rewards. The early hours of NEP were rewarding in a way the brain has logged carefully, cross-referenced with the memory of how those first hours felt, and filed under things worth pursuing again. The crash, the misery, the days of grey flatness, those are stored elsewhere, in a system that the reward circuitry consistently outshouts. This is not unique to NP. It is the mechanism of all stimulant dependence, but NEP's particular profile, high reward potential in the early phase, catastrophic consequences in the extended phase, creates a pattern that is both highly reinforcing and highly damaging, often simultaneously. Reports of compulsive use, of people continuing long after they wanted to stop, appear throughout the harm reduction literature. The drug is deeply unpleasant. That does not make it easy to quit. The memory asymmetry of addiction is one of the most clinically significant and least intuitively understood features of substance dependence. The brain does not store all memories equally. Emotionally salient experiences, particularly those involving dopamine-mediated reward, are encoded more vividly and accessed more readily than neutral or even negative experiences. This means that the memory of the first few hours of NEP, the warmth, the energy, the feeling of capability and connection, is stored in a way that is both robust and highly accessible. The memory of day 4, the dissociation, the aching jaw, the ceiling that was doing something, the heart that wouldn't slow down, is stored differently, in systems that are less readily activated by the cues associated with drug use. When someone in a social setting encounters the smell or sight or context associated with their early NEP experience, what activates is the good memory. The bad one is theoretically available but experientially distant. This is why people who have sworn off a drug find themselves using again in the same context where they first encountered it. It is not that they forgot. It is that the memory they have immediate access to, in that moment, in that context, is the one that the dopamine system encoded most thoroughly. And the dopamine system encoded the first hours most thoroughly, because those were the hours of maximum reward. The punishment was real. The punishment is remembered, in the abstract, as a fact. But facts and experiential memory are not the same thing, and in the moment of decision, it is experiential memory that wins. Synthetic cathinone dependence has been documented clinically, and NEP specifically appears in case reports of people who developed compulsive use patterns despite clear and first-hand knowledge of its consequences. These cases are not characterized by people who didn't know better. They're often characterized by people who knew exactly how bad it was going to get, and found that this knowledge did not produce the outcome they wanted. This is the nature of the condition. Knowledge of harm and control over response to the substance are separate things, mediated by separate neural systems, and treating them as equivalent. Assuming that information is sufficient, that if people knew better, they would do better, is one of the most persistent errors in thinking about addiction. People in the grip of stimulant dependence have frequently already learned what you're trying to teach them. The teaching is not the intervention. the question of whether NEP is addictive in the formal clinical sense, whether it produces physiological dependence with recognised withdrawal criteria, is complicated by the recency of the substance and the absence of clinical trials. The behavioural and neurochemical evidence is consistent with stimulant class addictive potential. High reward salience, compulsive use patterns, difficulty stopping despite consequences. Whether the DSM would stamp a formal diagnosis on that pattern is somewhat beside the point for the person sitting in their kitchen at 6 a.m, wondering how they got here again. NEP didn't emerge from a pharmaceutical research program or a clandestine operation in a rented warehouse. It emerged from legitimate organic chemistry. The cathinone family of compounds, of which NEP is a member, was extensively studied by scientists developing legitimate treatments, and many of the synthetic variations were documented in academic literature long before anyone thought to sell them at parties. This research, published openly and accessible to anyone with a chemistry degree and a subscription to the right journal, became a kind of inadvertent design catalogue for the novel psychoactive substance market. Chemists, some operating legally, some not, many in jurisdictions where the activity existed in a grey area, work through the documented compounds methodically, synthesizing, testing and distributing. NEP was one of dozens produced this way. The academic literature described its structure. The market provided demand. The gap between those two facts was, for several years, essentially unregulated. The legitimate scientific interest in cathinone derivatives had a coherent history. In the 1970s and 80s, pharmaceutical companies investigated synthetic cathinones as potential stimulant medications, appetite suppressants, antidepressants, treatments for attention disorders. Some of these compounds showed clinical promise. Methadone, for example, a cathinone relative, was used as an appetite suppressant before being withdrawn due to cardiovascular concerns. The research generated extensive structural data, synthesis protocols, and pharmacological characterizations. All of this was published, because that is how science works. It went into journals, into databases, into the cumulative record of chemistry knowledge that is accessible to anyone with the relevant educational background. The novel psychoactive substance manufacturers who found this literature were not, for the most part, rogue scientists with dramatic underground laboratories. Many were trained chemists, some with academic or pharmaceutical industry backgrounds, operating legally in countries where their activity wasn't yet prohibited. China was, for most of the synthetic cathinone era, the largest single source of these compounds, not because of any particular regulatory failure specific to China, but because it had a large, highly trained chemistry workforce, established pharmaceutical manufacturing infrastructure, and, during the key period, a regulatory framework that hadn't yet addressed this specific category of compound. By the time Chinese authorities implemented significant restrictions on novel psychoactive substance production in 2015 and 2017, the global market was well established and the supply chains had diversified. The chemistry itself is not especially exotic. The modifications that produce synthetic cathinones from the parent compound are standard undergraduate organic chemistry, the kind of reactions taught in second-year courses. This is not to minimise the skill involved, but to note that the barrier to production was primarily regulatory, not technical. The knowledge was accessible. The precursors were available through legitimate industrial chemical supply chains. The equipment was standard. What made production possible was not unusual expertise, but the absence of effective oversight in the relevant jurisdictions during the critical window of the market's development. By the time oversight arrived, the product was already circulating widely enough that domestic production in multiple countries had supplemented and to some extent replaced the original import supply. The relationship between open scientific publication and the novel psychoactive substance market is one of the more uncomfortable ironies of the era. The knowledge was produced in good faith for legitimate purposes and published in the interest of scientific transparency. The consequence of that transparency, in the specific context of a poorly regulated global chemical market and high recreational drug demand, was a design catalogue for substances that cause significant harm. There is no clean resolution to this irony. The alternative, restricting scientific publication on potentially abusable compound classes, carries its own costs for legitimate research. The problem was not the publication, it was everything else. The legislative response to synthetic cathinones has been, to put it diplomatically, consistently behind the curve. Each time a specific compound was scheduled and banned, a chemically adjacent compound would appear. By the time NEP was being flagged in emergency rooms, legislators were still working their way through bans on its predecessors. The United Kingdom passed the Psychoactive Substances Act in 2016, a broad piece of legislation that attempted to ban any substance intended to produce a psychoactive effect in humans, rather than listing specific compounds. It was creative. It was controversial among harm reduction advocates, who argued it would push drug use further underground. It did to some degree change the market, but it did not end the chemistry. New compounds continued to appear. The regulatory framework was chasing molecules at a speed that molecules do not have to reciprocate. The compound-by-compound scheduling approach that dominated the early legislative response to novel psychoactive substances was rational in design and structurally inadequate in practice. Each ban required identifying a specific compound, documenting its harms, completing a formal scheduling review, passing legislation, and implementing enforcement. This process took months, sometimes years. The chemical modification of an existing compound to produce a new one that wasn't yet scheduled, that had a different molecular name, that could be sold legally while the original was banned, took days. The asymmetry was not a bug in the legal process. It was simply the difference between institutional timescales and chemical ones. Institutions move at the speed of deliberation. Chemistry moves at the speed of synthesis. The Psychoactive Substances Act represented a different legislative philosophy, banning the category rather than the specific compound. Instead of adding another molecule to a list, Parliament attempted to define the legal status of any substance that produced a psychoactive effect in humans. The definition was intentionally broad. The exceptions were narrow: alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, medical products. Everything else that could produce psychoactive effects in a human being was, by definition, now covered. This was a significant departure and, in its ambition, something genuinely novel in global drug policy. The enforcement challenges were immediate. How do you prove, in a criminal prosecution, that a substance produces a psychoactive effect? The legislation required demonstrating that a substance had the capacity to produce such effects, which required expert toxicological evidence, which was available but resource-intensive. The practical result was that prosecutions focused on clear cases of distribution and sale, rather than the chemical frontiers of the market. The vendors who had been operating in the open, the legal high shops that populated UK high streets during the peak novel psychoactive substance period, were shuttered. The market moved online and to darker channels. This is not necessarily a worse outcome, but it is a different one from what the legislation's proponents envisioned. The international dimension complicated everything. Scheduling in the United Kingdom, or the United States, or Australia doesn't affect production in jurisdictions where the substance isn't banned. It affects supply chains and markets in the banning country without touching the chemistry. Effective regulatory response to novel psychoactive substances requires international coordination, agreements between producing and consuming countries, information sharing about emerging compounds, coordinated scheduling that doesn't simply push supply from one jurisdiction to another. This coordination has improved since the peak of the novel psychoactive substance era, largely through United Nations mechanisms and bilateral arrangements. It remains imperfect. The chemistry remains faster than the coordination. In the absence of effective regulation, and in the knowledge that people were using NEP regardless of legal status or documented risk, harm reduction organisations stepped in. Organisations like Dance Safe in the United States and The Loop in the United Kingdom began operating at festivals and events, offering drug checking services, the ability to test a substance and tell a person what it actually contained before they took it. The results were often surprising to the people being tested. What they thought was MDMA was sometimes NEP. What they thought was a moderate dose of one thing was sometimes a significant dose of something much stronger. The value of this service was not philosophical. It was practical. People who discovered they had NEP instead of what they intended to buy frequently made different decisions about whether or how much to take. The existence of accurate information changed behaviour. This is the unglamorous, enormously effective, persistently underfunded work of keeping people alive in a world where the supply chain is invisible and the contents are unlabelled. Harm reduction as a philosophy begins from an empirical rather than a moral premise, that drug use occurs regardless of legal status or social disapproval, that the consequences of drug use vary enormously depending on context, information, and support, and that reducing harm is both possible and valuable, independent of whether use itself is reduced. This is not, as critics sometimes frame it, an endorsement of drug use. It is an acknowledgement that the alternative to harm reduction is not a world without drug use. It is a world with drug use and more harm. The evidence supporting this position, accumulated over decades and across multiple contexts, is considerable. The drug-checking services that began operating at music events in the United Kingdom in the mid-2010s were implementing this philosophy in one of its most direct forms. A person approaches a tent at a festival. They give a small sample of what they intend to take. A technician performs a rapid chemical analysis using techniques like reagent testing, which produces colour reactions indicating compound class or mass spectrometry, which can identify specific compounds, and tells the person what they have. The conversation that follows is non-judgmental and specific. This is what you have. This is what is known about it. These are the factors that would increase or decrease risk. The person makes their own decision. They have more information than they arrived with. The impact of this intervention has been studied at events where it was deployed. A significant proportion of people, estimates vary, but consistent findings suggest between 10 and 20% of those receiving unexpected results choose not to take the substance at all after learning what it contains. A larger proportion choose to take a substantially reduced amount. A smaller proportion take their original plan but with additional information about what to watch for and what to do if something goes wrong. Every one of these outcomes represents a harm reduction, not perfection, not abstinence, reduction. That's what the name means. The political obstacles to harm reduction services are real and persistent. Organisations operating at events have sometimes faced withdrawal of permission by event organisers concerned about legal liability or public image. In some jurisdictions, staff have faced legal risk for handling drug samples for testing purposes. Funding is chronically insufficient relative to need. And the philosophical opposition, the belief that providing safety information to people who intend to use drugs is somehow complicit in their use, persists in policy circles in a way that is largely disconnected from evidence. The evidence says these services save lives. The political obstacles say this is nevertheless complicated. The gap between those two positions costs something. It usually costs something borne by the person in the festival tent, who didn't get to talk to anyone with a testing kit before they took what they thought was MDMA. Most drug-related emergencies do not involve one drug. They involve 2 or 3, taken in combination by a person who may not have known what any of them were. NEP in combination with alcohol, a depressant, creates a situation where the stimulant masks the sedative effects, meaning a person feels less drunk than they are while their liver and cardiovascular system are managing both simultaneously. NEP combined with MDMA or with cocaine multiplies the cardiovascular strain in ways that are not simply additive, and NEP combined with benzodiazepines or other sedatives sometimes taken desperately by a person trying to force sleep after days of wakefulness, creates its own set of complications. The heart is still being stimulated while the nervous system is being artificially suppressed. These combinations show up repeatedly in the harm reduction literature and in the emergency room records. They are not accidents. They are the result of people trying to manage an unmanageable situation with whatever tools are available. The alcohol masking effect is one of the most consistently documented hazards of stimulant-depressant combinations, and it is particularly relevant to NEP given the context in which the drug was most commonly encountered. At parties and festivals, alcohol is the ambient substance. It's available, it's social, it's expected. NEP stimulant effects suppress the subjective experience of intoxication, the slurring, the loss of coordination, the creeping sedation that normally serves as the body's warning system for having had enough. A person drinking steadily while on NEP may feel completely sober, or very nearly so, while their blood alcohol level climbs to genuinely dangerous territory. The warning system has been bypassed. The body is absorbing alcohol without transmitting the signal that normally causes consumption to stop. This combination is not an unusual cause of alcohol poisoning in stimulant-using populations. The combination with MDMA, which also acts on dopamine, serotonin and norepinephrine, creates a cumulative pharmacological burden that exceeds the sum of its parts, particularly in cardiovascular terms. Both substances drive heart rate and blood pressure upward. Both cause vasoconstriction. Both produce hypothermia. Together, they push all of these effects into ranges that individually would have been more manageable. The emergency medicine literature on MDMA toxicity documents the cardiovascular and thermoregulatory mechanisms that have caused deaths. Adding a second, more potent cathinone-class stimulant to this picture is not a safe direction to travel. People did it, and continue to do it, because the combination was not planned. They thought they were taking one thing. It was another. The pharmacological interaction was not anticipated because the presence of NEP was not known. The desperate sedation attempts are the most tragic category of combination harm. A person who has been awake for 2 or 3 days, who is suffering the distress of stimulant psychosis, who is in physical discomfort and emotional crisis, is not in an ideal state for careful pharmacological reasoning. The logic is straightforward from the inside. Something is keeping me awake. A sedative should help me sleep. Benzodiazepines, if available, seem like the obvious tool. And benzodiazepines, used carefully and in proper clinical context, are indeed part of the treatment for stimulant toxicity. But self-administered benzodiazepines in unknown doses by a person whose cardiovascular system is under sustained stimulant-driven stress is not a controlled clinical intervention. It is a person in distress trying to fix something they do not fully understand with something they cannot properly calibrate. The risks of this combination are real and well documented. The impulse that produces it is completely understandable. These two facts coexist in most of the relevant case histories without producing a comfortable resolution. The broader point, which the polydrug data consistently underscores, is that drug safety information cannot be provided in chemical isolation. A warning about NEP that does not include information about combination risks is incomplete. A harm reduction intervention that addresses the primary substance without asking about what else someone has taken is missing part of the picture. The body receives everything at once. The assessment has to do the same. The immediate effects of NEP clear in days. The aftermath for some users does not. Anxiety disorders, panic attacks, and persistent paranoia following significant NEP exposure are documented throughout harm reduction communities and in clinical case reports. Some users describe months of elevated baseline anxiety, a nervous system that was stretched past its limits and snapped back, but not quite to its original shape. Depression in the weeks following heavy use is reported widely, consistent with the dopamine depletion model and with the general pattern of stimulant aftermath. More acutely, stimulant psychosis, the hallucinations and paranoia of the sleep-deprived, dopamine-flooded experience can in rare cases persist briefly even after the drug is cleared. The brain is an organ. It responds to injury the way organs do, imperfectly, gradually, and with varying success depending on the person, the dose, and what else was happening at the time. The persistence of anxiety after stimulant toxicity is among the most commonly reported lasting effects, and is consistent with what is understood about how the nervous system responds to sustained adrenergic overactivation. The body's stress response, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the sympathetic nervous system, was running at or near maximum for an extended period. Like a car alarm that has been triggered repeatedly, the system becomes, for a time, more sensitive than it was before. The threshold for triggering the alarm is lower. Things that would not previously have produced a notable anxiety response now produce one. This heightened reactivity typically reduces over weeks to months as the system recalibrates. It is not permanent. But during the period when it is present, it can be genuinely disabling, producing panic attacks in ordinary situations, generating a background hum of unease that makes functioning difficult. The relationship between NEP use and lasting psychotic symptoms is more complex and more contested. For the majority of users, stimulant psychosis resolves completely once the drug is cleared and sleep has been achieved. But in a smaller subset of users, particularly those with pre-existing vulnerability to psychotic conditions, those who used very heavily, and those who used over extended periods, the resolution is incomplete. Persistent paranoia, referential thinking, and in some cases ongoing auditory phenomena have been documented in people weeks after their last NEP use. The clinical question of whether these represent drug-triggered onset of an underlying condition, a direct neurotoxic effect of the substance, or a drug-prolonged episode that would have resolved more quickly with different management, is not always answerable from the case history alone. What is clear is that they occur and that they require treatment. The depression of the post-NEP period sits on the biochemical foundation, described in the crash section, but exists in a broader context. Most people coming out of a significant NEP experience are also dealing with consequences, disrupted relationships, professional impacts, financial costs, and frequently shame. The shame component is not pharmacological, but it interacts with the pharmacological depression in ways that are clinically relevant. Shame reduces help seeking. It delays the conversations that would allow someone to get support. It extends the period of isolation in which a depleted dopamine system is trying to recover in a social vacuum. The people who recover most completely are not, as a rule, those with the mildest experiences. They are those who told someone what happened and got some help with it. The neurochemistry and the human element are not separate problems. The long-term data on NEP-specific mental health outcomes is limited by the recency of the substance and the absence of prospective studies. What exists is mostly retrospective, case reports, harm reduction community self-reporting, emergency presentations that were followed up. The picture that emerges is not one of universal lasting damage, but it is also not one of universal clean recovery. Outcomes vary. The factors that predict better outcomes, good baseline mental health, shorter duration and lower total dose exposure, access to support, absence of polydrug complexity, are the same factors that predict better outcomes in stimulant recovery generally. NEP is not uniquely toxic in the long term. It is unusually capable of producing situations in which those protective factors are absent. The popular image of the novel psychoactive substance user is a teenager at a festival. The reality was considerably more complicated. NEP showed up across age ranges, across income brackets, and in contexts ranging from late-night parties to solitary use at home. A significant proportion of documented NEP users were experienced drug users who had taken it unknowingly, who had bought something else and received NEP instead. Others sought it deliberately, often because it was cheaper than MDMA or cocaine, and, in the early years, easier to obtain. Some were using it in the context of longer-term stimulant dependence, substituting NEP for other compounds that have become harder to source. The portrait that emerges from harm reduction data is not a simple one. It is a picture of a market where information is scarce, contents are unreliable, and people are making decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty. The moral judgment often applied to drug users rarely survives contact with that picture. The monkey dust phenomenon in parts of the West Midlands offered one of the more closely studied demographic snapshots. Emergency service data from Stoke-on-Trent showed NEP presenting heavily in populations associated with homelessness, street drug use, and multiple deprivation. These were not festival goers. They were people at the sharp end of social disadvantage, using a drug that was available, cheap, and potent in ways that other affordable stimulants were not. The media coverage of this period, which featured dramatic footage of people in states of acute stimulant psychosis in public spaces, generated significant public alarm and somewhat less significant public nuance. The people in those videos were in a medical crisis. They were also mostly people whose pre-crisis circumstances were characterized by the kinds of deprivation that make acute pharmacological crises more likely and more severe. Inadequate housing, limited access to healthcare, social isolation, histories of trauma. The drug was doing something to them. The drug was doing it in a context that made everything worse. In parallel and considerably less visibly, NEP was circulating in middle-class recreational contexts, house parties, club scenes, festival circuits, where users had more resources and more access to harm reduction information, but were by no means immune to its specific hazards. These users tended not to appear in the newspaper coverage. They tended to manage their experiences at home, to seek help through private healthcare if they needed it, and to discuss what happened in online forums rather than emergency departments. The harm they experienced was real. The visibility of that harm was substantially lower than the harm experienced by people with fewer resources. This is not a drug-specific phenomenon. It is the standard pattern of how drug-related harm is documented and responded to, which systematically overrepresents certain populations and underrepresents others. The age distribution was broader than the media image suggested. Youth drug use monitoring data from the UK and Europe showed NEP appearing among people in their 30s and 40s, as well as younger users, particularly in populations with existing stimulant use histories, where the compound was sometimes substituted for cocaine or other cathinones that had become more expensive or less available. These users brought their experience with other stimulants, which was both useful and misleading. They understood the category. They did not understand the specific compound. The familiarity bred a confidence that the compound did not warrant. The gendered dimension of NEP use is understudied, as it is for most novel psychoactive substances. What data exists suggests that women were, as in most stimulant use patterns, underrepresented in emergency presentations relative to their actual prevalence of use, a pattern usually attributed to a combination of lower average dose, different use contexts, and greater likelihood of managing complications at home or through informal networks rather than through formal health services. This underrepresentation in data is not the same as lower prevalence of harm. It is lower visibility of harm. These are not equivalent. Before health agencies were tracking NEP, before academic papers were being written about it, before it showed up in government reports, users were documenting it themselves. The harm reduction forums, Blue Light, Erowid, Reddit communities became, in the absence of official information, the primary source of collective knowledge about what NEP did and how bad it could get. Trip reports, often written in real time and with a slightly unhinged specificity of someone who's been awake for 60 hours, were read by thousands of people trying to understand what they had taken or were thinking about taking. Warnings were shared, patterns were identified. The community essentially ran its own adverse event monitoring system, unpaid, uncoordinated, and often writing from a state of personal crisis. It was not a replacement for clinical research. It was, for several years, the only research that existed in a form accessible to the people who needed it. The epistemological status of these reports is worth examining. They are not clinical data. They are self-reports, subject to all the limitations of self-report: imperfect recall, altered perception at the time of writing, motivated reasoning, the specific distortions produced by the neurochemical states being described. A person writing at hour 60 of a NEP experience is not a reliable research instrument. And yet, across hundreds of these reports, patterns emerged that were consistent enough and specific enough to contain genuine information. The consistency of the peripheral figure hallucinations across accounts written by different people in different countries at different times was not the result of suggestion or shared expectation. It was the same brain mechanism producing the same output. The forum was capturing something real, noisily but persistently. The specific value of real-time documentation is something that formal research struggles to replicate. A clinical case report, written by a clinician from notes taken during or after an emergency presentation, captures the medical picture at the point of crisis. It does not capture the progression, the hours between the first dose and the emergency, the specific texture of the experience as it worsened, the decisions made and not made along the way. The forum reports captured this progression in real time, because the people writing them had nowhere else to turn at 3 a.m, and writing was something to do that wasn't another dose. This documentary record, imperfect as it is, allowed subsequent users to understand what was coming in a way that no clinical literature available at the time could provide. The community norms of the harm reduction forum shaped what was written and how. These were not spaces that glorified drug use in the simplistic sense. They had established cultures of detailed reporting, dosing documentation, and explicit acknowledgement of negative outcomes. The concept of a trip report, a structured account of a drug experience including dose, context, timeline, and outcome, was well established and carried expectations of honesty that were enforced informally but effectively by community norms. A report that omitted negative effects or minimized harms was challenged. A report that provided useful safety information was upvoted, bookmarked, and shared. The community's incentive structure rewarded accuracy, because accuracy was what people came for. They were not looking for enthusiasm, they were looking for information. The relationship between these communities and formal public health infrastructure has evolved. Organizations like the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction began, over time, incorporating online forum data into their early warning systems for novel psychoactive substances. The crowdsourced signal, despite its methodological limitations, turned out to be faster and more granular than formal surveillance in identifying emerging compounds and their effects. This represents an unusual and somewhat awkward collaboration. Public health bodies incorporating data from communities whose activities they cannot officially endorse, because the data is too valuable to ignore. It is, as scientific collaborations go, not especially comfortable. It is genuinely effective. When NEP was formally scheduled in various jurisdictions, in the United Kingdom under the Misuse of Drugs Act, and in other countries through various legislative mechanisms, the market did not disappear. It adapted. Supply moved from surface web vendors to darker, less regulated channels. Quality control, already essentially non-existent, became worse. The price rose slightly. The information about what was being sold became even less reliable. This is not an argument against scheduling. The legal status of a drug has real effects on its prevalence, accessibility, and cultural normalization. But the experience with NEP and its predecessors demonstrated, clearly enough to satisfy even the skeptics, that criminalization alone does not make a substance stop existing or stop being consumed. The demand remained. The chemistry remained. The market found a way. The specific mechanism by which scheduling changes market dynamics has been studied in the context of multiple substances and is reasonably well understood. legal availability through surface web vendors, shops, online retailers operating in the open, allows for a degree of market visibility, price competition, and some level of quality control motivated by commercial incentives. A vendor selling a product legally wants repeat customers and minimal adverse event publicity. These incentives, while weak compared to pharmaceutical standards, are not zero. They produce a product that is at least somewhat consistent, because wildly inconsistent quality is bad for business. When scheduling moves the market underground, these commercial incentives weaken. The vendor is already operating illegally. The additional legal risk of poor quality control is marginal relative to the existing risk. The incentives that produced whatever limited consistency existed in the legal market no longer apply. The cultural signalling effects of scheduling are real and not to be dismissed. There is evidence that the legal status of a substance affects its perceived risk, that substances which are legal are assumed by at least some potential users to be safer than those that are not. The scheduling of successive novel psychoactive substances sent a public health signal. These things are dangerous enough to ban. This signal reached some potential users and changed their decisions. It did not reach all potential users. It did not reach users who did not know what they had taken. It did not change anything for people in heavily drug-using communities where the legal status of a substance had long since ceased to be a meaningful safety signal. The post-scheduling market for NEP became harder to study because it became harder to see. The clustering of presentations in emergency departments that had helped public health monitor its spread was reduced, not because the drug disappeared, but because the market fragmented and the product became harder to identify. Toxicological screens that had been developed to detect a NEP were now missing variants and analogues that appeared in its wake. The data got worse just as the problem continued. This is the surveillance paradox of drug scheduling. The act of scheduling a substance can reduce the quality of information about it precisely when that information is most needed. What scheduling did not do, what no scheduling has done with any stimulant of equivalent demand, is eliminate use. The people who were taking NEP before it was scheduled continued, in most cases, to take it or its successors after. The people who had developed dependent use patterns continued those patterns, now with worse supply quality, less reliable dosing, and greater legal exposure. The scheduling was a genuine public health intervention. Its effects were real and mixed. The story it tells about what scheduling can and cannot accomplish is not a comfortable one for advocates of any single policy position, which may be why it is not often told completely. People do recover from NEP experiences, including severe ones. The brain is a resilient organ, given time and the absence of further insult. The standard advice from harm reduction organisations and clinical professionals alike is patience, which is not the most satisfying prescription, but it is the accurate one. Sleep, real sleep, unassisted or assisted by a doctor if necessary. Food, when the appetite returns. Exercise gradually when the body permits. Time away from stimulants of all kinds while the dopamine system restabilizes. And critically, honesty with a doctor, with a therapist, with someone about what happened. Because shame is the enemy of treatment and the most reliable mechanism by which a recoverable situation becomes a chronic one. The people who do worst in the aftermath of heavy NEP use are frequently those who are most determined to treat it as something that didn't happen. The people who do best are those who tell someone and ask for help. The timeline of recovery is not linear, and managing expectations about this is one of the most practically important things that can be communicated to someone in the post-NEP period. Week 1, particularly if the experience was severe, is mostly about sleep, sleeping more than seems possible, waking feeling less than rested, eating tentatively, being surprised by how physically exhausted a few days of drug use has left a body that thought it felt fine during the whole thing. This week is uncomfortable but straightforward. The body is doing the obvious thing. Week 2 is frequently harder, not because the physical symptoms are worse, but because the anhedonia, the flatness, the inability to feel reward from ordinary things is now the dominant experience, and it is the one that is hardest to simply wait through. Exercise is worth specific mention, because the evidence for its role in dopaminergic recovery is substantial and often underutilized. Physical exercise, particularly aerobic exercise, stimulates dopamine production and release in ways that are modest by pharmacological standards but meaningful by recovery standards. A depleted dopamine system needs production, not just time. Exercise provides one of the cleanest available stimuli for that production. This is not a theory derived from animal models and cautiously extrapolated to humans. It is well supported in the clinical literature on stimulant recovery and in the practical experience of people who have navigated it. The difficulty is that exercise is hard to do when you cannot feel pleasure from it. The motivation required to exercise during anhedonia is substantial. The results, in most cases, are worth the effort. This is the uncomfortable math of recovery. The things that help most are hardest to do when you most need them. The social dimension of recovery is significant and often underweighted relative to the biochemical one. Stimulant use, particularly heavy stimulant use, tends to damage social relationships through the behavior of the using period, through the isolation that often accompanies it, and through the shame that prevents honest communication afterward. Recovery from NEP, like recovery from other stimulant dependence, happens faster and more completely in the presence of relationships. Not relationships where the drug use has to be hidden. Relationships where it can be acknowledged, where the person can be both the person who made the decisions they made and also someone worth supporting through the recovery from those decisions. These relationships are not always available. Harm reduction and recovery services exist partly to provide a version of this when informal support isn't accessible. The end point of recovery, the point at which someone can say they are back to whatever their baseline was, is not a moment. It is a gradual stabilization that most people recognize in retrospect more clearly than they do while it's happening. One day the music sounds good again. One day food tastes like something. One day the anxiety doesn't show up with the morning. These are the markers. They arrive in their own time, irregularly, without announcement. The brain comes back. It does this even when it takes longer than seemed possible, even when the middle part of the recovery looks indistinguishable from not recovering. It comes back. That is worth knowing when you're in the part that doesn't feel like that's what's happening. NEP did not arrive alone, and it did not leave without successors. The synthetic cathinone family continues to expand, with new compounds appearing in drug checking results and harm reduction reports regularly. Some are milder than NEP, some are not. Each one arrives on the market with the same fundamental information deficit: unknown dosing, unknown duration, unknown safety profile, unknown interaction risks. The chemists who make them know the molecular structure. They do not know what it does to a human being at 2 a.m. after 4 days without sleep. That knowledge accumulates, slowly and expensively, in emergency rooms and harm reduction forums, and the memories of people who would prefer to have learned it some other way. The chemical innovations keep arriving. The capacity to predict their effects does not keep pace. The structural diversity of the synthetic cathinone family is, from a purely chemical perspective, remarkable. The modifications that produce different compounds in this class are numerous and combinatorially varied. Changes to the alpha carbon chain, substitutions on the aromatic ring, modifications to the amine group, additions of fluorine atoms, extensions or contractions of the carbon backbone. Each modification produces a compound with a distinct pharmacological profile, different receptor affinities, different metabolic pathways, different durations of action. From a drug designer's perspective, this diversity is a feature. It means that when one compound is scheduled, there are many adjacent compounds available to substitute. From a public health perspective, it means that each new compound is genuinely novel. The experience with predecessors predicts effects only partially, if at all. The surveillance infrastructure for detecting new compounds has improved substantially since the peak of the novel psychoactive substance era. The European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, along with equivalent organisations in North America, Australia and elsewhere, operates early warning systems that combine drug checking data, harm reduction forum monitoring, emergency department toxicology, and direct forensic analysis of seized samples. These systems can identify a new compound in circulation faster than was possible in 2015. What they cannot do is identify a compound before anyone has taken it, or predict its effects from structure alone with sufficient precision to generate useful safety guidance. The pharmacology of novel compounds must still be learned through some combination of animal models, in vitro testing, and inevitably, in a market that doesn't pause for toxicology, human exposure. The surveillance systems document this exposure faster than before. The exposure still happens. The compounds that followed NEP in circulation have varied widely in their harm profiles. Some synthetic cathinones that emerged in the same period as NEP, N-Ethylpentylone for example, were reported to produce considerably shorter and more manageable experiences, with less compulsive redosing and less severe sleep disruption. This is not a guarantee of safety, and N-Ethylpentylone has its own documented harms, but it illustrates that the family is not monolithic. The diversity of effects is genuine, and the risk profiles of individual compounds are individual. The blanket category of bath salts or synthetic cathinones does not communicate this diversity in a way that supports informed decision-making by people likely to encounter these substances. The trajectory of the cathinone market since the mid-2010s has been shaped by the interaction of scheduling, harm reduction, and changing drug market economics. In some regions and populations, synthetic cathinones have receded as other compounds became more prevalent. In others, they remain embedded in local drug supply chains in ways that are resistant to both legislative and public health pressure. The compounds change. The underlying dynamics, cheap synthesis, high potency, inadequate information, persistent demand, do not change. The next compound in the family exists. It may already be in circulation. Someone, somewhere, is probably writing about it on a forum at 4 a.m. The history of NEP is, among other things, a case study in the gap between what prohibition is designed to achieve and what it actually achieves. The goal of scheduling a substance is, roughly speaking, to make it unavailable and thereby reduce the harm it causes. What the synthetic cathinone era demonstrated is that when demand is strong enough and chemistry is flexible enough, scheduling one compound reliably produces a successor compound that may be less understood and therefore more dangerous. This is not an argument for anything specific. It is a description of what happened. NEP existed because its predecessors were banned. Its successors exist because NEP was banned. The compounds keep changing. The people taking them keep taking risks they don't fully understand. The cycle continues, and the bodies in the emergency rooms keep arriving with drugs in their systems that the doctors sometimes have to look up. The theoretical framework of prohibition assumes a relatively stable target. The substance to be controlled is identified, characterized, and banned, and the ban reduces its availability. This framework works adequately for substances whose production requires specific and controllable infrastructure. Coca plants in specific geographic regions, for example, or opium poppies in specific agricultural contexts. It works less well for substances that can be synthesized from widely available industrial precursors in a standard laboratory. And it works poorly for a class of substances where the specific compound is less important than the general category, because banning a compound in a category with hundreds of potential substitutes simply selects for the next substitute. The substitution effect produced by synthetic cathinone scheduling was not theoretically unexpected. Drug policy researchers had modelled and predicted it. The problem was that the legislative response, which operated on the logic of controlling specific named substances, did not have a mechanism for responding to the category as a category, rather than the compound as a compound. This was not a failure of intent. It was a failure of fit between the legal instrument and the problem it was being applied to. The law was designed for a world where new psychoactive substances emerged slowly enough that they could be individually assessed and individually banned. In the world of novel psychoactive substances, where dozens of compounds could enter the market in the time it took to complete one scheduling review, that framework was structurally inadequate. The Psychoactive Substances Act's attempt to address the category, rather than the compound, was a genuine innovation and a genuine improvement in some respects, particularly in closing the legal high shop market. But it came with costs. The most significant was the displacement of the market into less visible and less regulated channels. A harm reduction argument for legal availability of any substance is complicated, and the political context makes it almost impossible to advance without misrepresentation. But the empirical observation that moving drug supply underground tends to worsen quality, reduce information availability, and increase the distance between users and health services is solid. The Psychoactive Substances Act produced some of these effects in the synthetic cathinone market, as it produced them in other parts of the legal high market. These were predictable outcomes. They were predicted. They were accepted as less bad than the alternative. Whether they were right about that is a judgment that requires values as well as data. The limits of prohibition do not argue for its abandonment. They argue for its supplementation. The evidence base for what reduces drug-related harm is broader than prohibition versus legalization. It includes harm reduction services, treatment availability, accurate information provision, social support for people-independent use, and the reduction of the social inequalities that make drug-related harm unevenly distributed. These interventions work alongside legal frameworks, not instead of them. NEP's history is not an argument for selling synthetic cathinones in shops. It is an argument for doing more than scheduling them. Somewhere in this story, mostly off stage, are the people who spend their professional lives trying to make it less catastrophic. The toxicologists who identify novel compounds from emergency presentations. The chemists at drug-checking organisations who test samples at festivals and publish their findings. The addiction medicine physicians who treat the aftermath without judgment. The harm reduction workers who stand in festival fields at 3 a.m. with testing kits and water and a willingness to talk to whoever needs to talk. These people are not celebrated. They work in an area that is politically uncomfortable and frequently underfunded. They don't prevent every bad outcome. No system does. But the evidence consistently shows that their presence reduces harm in measurable ways. Fewer overdoses at events with drug-checking services, better outcomes for people who access non-judgmental treatment early. The science of keeping people alive in an imperfect world is not glamorous, but it is effective. The toxicologist's role in the novel psychoactive substance era has been both more demanding and more intellectually unusual than the job description typically implies. Standard forensic toxicology identifies known compounds in biological samples using established reference standards. Novel psychoactive substance toxicology requires identifying unknown compounds, sometimes compounds that have never been previously characterized, from clinical or post-mortem samples, using techniques that can generate structural information about entirely new chemical entities. This is not routine analytical work. It requires instruments, expertise, and reference libraries that many standard laboratories do not have. The teams that built this capacity during the peak novel psychoactive substance period did so under conditions of genuine urgency, and with resources that were generally insufficient for the scale of the problem. Their output, the identification of compounds, the characterization of harms, the early warnings fed into surveillance systems, is invisible to most people. It is nonetheless the foundation on which every other response to this problem is built. The drug-checking chemists occupy an unusual professional space. They are often trained analytical chemists applying high-level technical skills in field conditions, tents at music festivals, mobile laboratories at events, harm reduction centres with equipment that costs considerably less than what their training prepared them to use. They work with samples that may contain anything, in quantities that are too small for comfortable error margins, and produce results that will inform decisions made by people who may be already intoxicated. The margin for error in this work is not academic. It is the difference between a person making an informed decision and a person making an uninformed one, which is the difference that the entire harm reduction apparatus is designed to narrow. They do it for salaries that do not reflect this. The emergency medicine physicians who receive NEP presentations occupy the hardest position in this system, because they are the final net under everything that failed upstream. The patient who arrives in their department is past the point where information, access to checking services, better supply quality or earlier intervention could have changed what is happening. The physician's job is to manage what is in front of them with the tools available and within the constraints of a health system that is typically not resourced for the specific demands of stimulant toxicity. They do this without judgment, not because they have no views on the circumstances that produced the presentation, but because judgment is irrelevant to the clinical task and because the person in front of them is a person who needs help, not an assessment of their decision-making. The non-judgmental approach is not a therapeutic philosophy, it is a clinical standard. It is also, for many patients in this circumstance, the first non-judgmental response they have encountered in the process of seeking help. The harm reduction workers at the sharp end, the ones in the field, at events, in the communities where NEP was circulating most heavily, are doing work that is rarely studied or documented and often not formally recognised as healthcare. They are providing information, connection and practical support in contexts where formal healthcare is not accessible or not sought. Their impact is real. The evidence that their presence changes behaviour, that people who interact with harm reduction services use more safely, seek help earlier, and have better outcomes, is sufficient to support their work clearly. What is less clear is why, given that evidence, the political and funding support for these services remains so thin. That question is not answered by the evidence, it is answered by politics, and the politics of harm reduction has never been especially favourable to the people who need it most. NEP is not a story with an ending. It is a chapter in a longer story about the collision of organic chemistry, unregulated markets, imperfect legal frameworks, and the fundamentally human tendency to want to feel something different from what one currently feels. The designer drug problem, the endless emergence of novel compounds, each one unknown, each one entering the market without clinical trials or safety data, is not solved. It is ongoing. The tools available to address it are the same ones that were available a decade ago. Scheduling, harm reduction, education, treatment. Their effectiveness varies, their coverage is incomplete, and meanwhile, somewhere, a compound that doesn't have a name yet is being synthesized in a lab that doesn't have a safety inspector, and someone is going to take it at a party before anyone knows what it does. The question for the next chapter of this story is whether we learn anything from the one we've been reading. The trajectory of the novel psychoactive substance market since the peak of the synthetic cathinone era is instructive in what it says about the problem's fundamental nature. The market did not end. It evolved. The synthetic cathinone category receded somewhat in some markets as regulatory and supply chain pressures accumulated. Other categories expanded. Synthetic opioids, fentanyl and its analogues moved into spaces previously occupied by heroin, producing mortality patterns that dwarfed anything associated with synthetic cathinones. New classes of synthetic drugs with no predecessors in traditional pharmacology began appearing. The underlying dynamic, chemistry faster than regulation, demand faster than supply quality control, information slower than products, was not resolved. It is the permanent condition of drug markets in a world with open scientific publishing, global supply chains, and imperfect regulatory coordination. The analytic tools available to track and respond to this problem have improved since the height of the novel psychoactive substance era. Mass spectrometry and other analytical techniques capable of identifying novel compounds have become faster, cheaper, and more widely deployed. The surveillance infrastructure, the networks connecting drug-checking laboratories, harm reduction organisations, clinical toxicologists and public health agencies is more integrated than it was. Early warning systems fire faster. The window between a novel compound appearing in the market and a public health response being mounted has shortened. This is genuine progress. It is not sufficient progress. The new compound that arrives faster than the warning can be issued still arrives. What has changed is that the warning arrives sooner. What hasn't changed is that the compound was in circulation before the warning. The fentanyl analogue crisis provides a model for where the synthetic cathinone story could have gone, and in some contexts did go. When a compound class combines high potency, low price, small effective dose, and supply chain integration, the mortality consequences can escalate rapidly. Synthetic cathinones, for all their capacity to cause serious harm, did not produce the mortality numbers associated with synthetic opioids, largely because the acute overdose mechanism is different. You can die from stimulant toxicity. The mechanism is less forgiving, dose for dose, than opioid respiratory depression in a naive user. This means that the ceiling of harm, while real, was lower than it might have been with a different pharmacological profile. The lesson this offers is not that synthetic cathinones were safe enough. It is that the same market dynamics applied to a different compound class could produce substantially worse outcomes, and, in the case of synthetic opioids, has done exactly that. What would learning from this story look like in practice? It would look like harm reduction services that are funded proportionally to their evidence base rather than their political palatability. It would look like early warning systems that are resourced and integrated enough to be genuinely early. It would look like drug checking services at the scale of the population that needs them, rather than the funding that supports them. It would look like treatment services that are available without waiting lists to people who have recognised a problem and are ready to address it, understanding that this window is narrow and that filling it with a waiting list is its own kind of harm. None of this requires resolving the fundamental political disagreements about drug policy. All of it would reduce harm within whatever policy framework exists. The story is not over. The question is what we choose to do with it. And so here we are, the other side. You've spent the last however many hours drifting through one of the stranger corners of modern pharmacology. A world of unlabeled powders, racing hearts, walls that breathe, and the specific, terrible patience required to wait out a nervous system that forgot how to stop. It is not, by any measure, a comfortable place to have visited, but you visited from your bed, which means you came out fine. Better than fine, actually. You came out horizontal, warm, and in possession of all your faculties, which puts you well ahead of several of the people in tonight's story. Think for a moment about what your body is doing right now. Your heart rate is somewhere between 60 and 80 beats per minute, doing its quiet, unremarkable job without you having to think about it. Your dopamine system is not depleted. It is simply resting, refilling, running its usual overnight maintenance, the kind that requires sleep to complete, and that NEP for days at a time simply would not allow. Your brain, behind your closed eyes, is beginning to do the extraordinary ordinary thing it does every night. Sorting the day, consolidating memory, running the processes that make tomorrow's thinking possible. You didn't earn any of this. You were born with it. It works whether you notice it or not. It is, in its quiet way, remarkable. The people in tonight's story were not villains. They were not cautionary tales designed for your benefit. They were people who made decisions under conditions of incomplete information, in markets designed to obscure rather than inform, in states of neurochemical compromise that made good reasoning difficult in the specific moment when good reasoning was most needed. Some of them are fine. Some of them took longer than they expected to get there. Some of them are still working on it. All of them would have benefited from more information, more support, and less judgment than they typically received. What the history of NEP leaves behind, beyond the emergency room records, the forum threads, the case reports, is something quieter. It is the evidence that people, even in the middle of experiences that were genuinely terrible, reached out to help each other. They wrote the warnings. They sat with their friends through the long nights. They showed up at the festival tents to test the substances and have the honest conversations. They did this without institutional backing, without adequate funding, with nothing more than the understanding that someone was going to go through this and might be less alone in it if someone who had been there said something true about what it was like. That impulse toward honesty, toward care, toward the practical work of reducing harm in an imperfect world is not a small thing. It is in fact the thing that has always carried people through the parts of history that didn't come with instructions. So tonight, as you settle into the quiet, let your body do its work. Let the sleep come. The ceiling is just a ceiling. The fan is just a fan. You are exactly where you are. And that, for tonight, is exactly enough.